Guess who's back? Back again. So I used that joke. I was doing my Eminem when I was in London because, I went there for, call it 25 days, back here for 10, and then back for 12. And I sent that. None of the Brits got the joke.
They didn't get it.
No Eminem joke, sense of humor in London. But anyway.
And we're going to have potentially Eminem and Taylor Swift.
Super
Bowl matchup.
I mean,
that's going to be awesome.
The Brits just don't like Americans. How about that?
Ooh.
Wow, that was a shot across the bow.
Would have been nice if you would have told me that 18 months ago. All righty. So I heard when I was gone, missed the big storm. Heather?
Yes.
Heather was her name. And ERCOT, I heard, held up reasonably well. And when I got back, my guy that knows all about the grid, I texted, I said, hey, here's what I'm hearing, that West Texas wind was bad. Gulf Coast and South Texas wind, good. Batteries were actually good. Demand was the true superstar because it was 13% below expectations on Monday, 10% below on Tuesday. His take was, we got lucky, we had enough wind. ERCOT's new operating stance and winter inspections really made a difference for thermal units. Batteries need to report the state of their charge. That's something we learned this time. And the PUC erred on that, but we did get lucky. So that's kind of what I heard about it. Well, you guys were here fighting it out.
I mean, I got in a Twitter war with a few guys over this. They're saying, why are you knocking solar and wind because it actually saved your ass? I'm like, that's not the point. The point is that ERCOT prioritized all these renewables into the grid, making it more unstable instead of planning for a more resilient grid. We did get, so my point about Heather, we got lucky. I'm glad wind came through to some degree. But the reality is demand was down, and that's
you still had periods where natural gas, coal, and nuclear were 85% of the stack.
Yes. I saw as high as 95%.
Yeah, and
I got notices by ERCOT like, hey, by the way, just try to preserve. We all, of course, everyone just cranked their heat up when that happened.
Unlike Uri, at least in my experience, we didn't have really any moisture to speak of either.
That's true.
Not a lot of ice-related problems to deal with. I don't know where the pockets in the state were, but that seemed to help as well, at least help me. I had texted you about what did you do with your house, and you had the foresight to shut it off at the street and drain everything.
Yeah, I was across the pond, and so I did it. And Mark, real quick on the moisture issue, what are the ramifications of that, of a freeze? Is it causing natural gas pipelines to freeze up easier? It's causing repair crews harder to get out because of ice?
Well, I think it's that, and mostly you don't have the damage that you have from a bunch of ice on power lines and trees that are wreaking havoc as well. So we didn't even have a flicker. Of course, I'm on Entergy and MISO, but
yeah, you're not even in ERCOT.
Right.
You're not even a Texan.
I'm on the island, or on the peninsula.
Do people on the island think that like is it sort of like the Austin syndrome? Y'all are the center of Texas. The Woodlands is what we're talking about.
We had a lot of inbound migration. Let's just say that.
We're moving the capital to the Woodlands.
Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. Yeah, it's the weirdest thing to look at the map and see that there's this peninsula, but it's been that way for a long time.
So let's do this. So are we spiking a football that everything worked, Senate Bill 4 from 2021, which was the response to Winter Storm Uri? Are we saying we just got lucky? Are we saying somewhere in between?
We're somewhere in between.
Yeah.
I'm glad it wasn't worse. That's
I am too.
At the end of the day, we're glad it wasn't worse.
Yeah.
And the awareness does quite a bit. If you've been through it once and ERCOT or anyone else sends out a notice to take it a little bit easier and you find ways to do that, then, if the demand response was a result of proactive notices going out saying, look, we need to kind of lighten up here where you can.
My generator went off one time, and I'm not sure if it was just testing, but it didn't go on during the normal test period. So I'm assuming my power went out for just a short period. So just saying.
Well, to your point about awareness too, is I think the power generators, particularly the folks using natural gas, nuclear, and kind of oopsed last time and probably had their A game on this time.
Well, last time also you had a lot of you had the natural gas had some failures along key points. So it wasn't necessarily the fact that they didn't have their ducks in a row. It's the fact that it was so cold and you had ice that some of the equipment needed to move gas around didn't work.
I mean, on Winter Storm Uri, you had literally folks that had coal that they were using to heat, natural gas pipelines and all that sort of stuff, and it was frozen in. So I'm sure things like that got worked out. And the last time in Winter Storm Uri, the big nuke plant in South Texas went down because there was literally one sensor. So it had a single point of failure that shut down. And so I'm sure there were 2 points of failure this time.
That's right.
And so, yeah, so it probably is somewhere in the middle. The other thing this just highlights that you guys will say, well, no shit, Sherlock, but I don't know that I appreciate it. If you think about the shale revolution and oil, for as much as we gripe about, it's so hard to, get a permit and drill for a well in Texas and Montana and Oklahoma and all this. No, it's really not. It's actually really easy. You can put oil into a tank, you can pick it up with a truck, and you can get it to the market. To solve what we're going to need to solve on the power grid, it's also interrelated. I mean, this, it was wild in that parts of the state were trading for $300 per megawatt, and in Corpus Christi and Brownsville, it was trading at $20 a megawatt, and that just highlights you can generate it. You've also got to move it. You've got to have transmission lines. And I read an article about there's a Pattern Energy is trying to build the Southern Spirit Line, which is basically going to pull, in effect, nuclear electricity out of Mississippi to Dallas and then send solar back the other way. And they're doing it in such a way that it's not going to be FERC regulated and it's going to be DC power and all. But this is just really, really complicated. So if we're going to need more electricity, this is not going to be handled like the shale revolution was. And anyway.
Well said, Chuck.
All right. Well, that's my part of the show. I've talked enough. But no, so second, the other thing I heard I missed is that Mark Mills wrote a really cool piece. Mark, what was it?
It's basically, he published two, actually. One last week, early to middle part of last week, the date escapes me, with an abridged version on Saturday, really calling for reform at the IEA and just looking back at the history of the IEA and why it was established, which for those who don't spend time down in the weeds thinking about the IEA was established in response to the 74 crisis and the Arab embargo, when Western governments were looking around trying to find options and responses and finding that there wasn't really a good basis of information and data around the world. So that really established the objective, the raison d'etre, if you will, of the IEA, which over the last 5 to 10 years, as Mark points out, has morphed into one of strong advocacy for renewables and transition. And his point is it's really contaminating the original mission. And the U.S. is as it always has been, the largest funder of the IEA. And basically in this last piece says, look, you got to break it up into two entities. One where the member countries who are paying for the advocacy get that, but we need to preserve the original aspect of the IEA that is about the best data and information and analysis on the energy here and now and what reality is. And one of the comments he made in the And the original piece, I think, sums it up, at least his sentiment, pretty well, and I think it captures it pretty well. It says, the IEA, quote, is now animated by an outcome that it hopes for rather than analyzing the realities that exist. And so I think there are some, myself included, that you start to look at the data that the IEA provides and wonder about how conflicted that data and analysis is, given just the overarching, I think, political bent of the IEA and what it's become over the last 5 to 10 years.
I mean, the 1974 crisis taught the world that there is a need for unbiased energy information. When I think most younger people, especially if you ask them what the EIA is and their ability to forecast or give unbiased information, it's a joke. I mean, they've become a very biased organization, and I thought Mark's point was spot on. Both Mark Meyer and Mark Mills.
Ooh,
by the way,
M squared.
Double entendres, M squared,
2 MMs,
Mark squared. I thought he was totally right. That was actually very poignant. Mark sometimes brings some great analysis, doesn't he? Mark squared.
Mark squared.
You know, the interesting thing I thought in kind of reading that article was, if you're intellectually honest, if you truly want what's good for the world and you want a much lower carbon footprint for the world to save it, you should want good data too. Right? Because there are no right choices in life. There are just trade-offs that we're going to have to make, and we're going to have to be thoughtful. And each side, you know, as we talk about all the time, I mean, people that don't have cheap energy in the winter freeze today. So, you know, as we're balancing things, as we're making all these decisions, you should want as good a data too.
The good news, Chuck, is you don't need to go to the IEA. You need to come to Digital Wildcatters, BDE.
There we go.
Because we deliver real energy information, which, speaking of, so that was a great piece by Mark Squared. But let's go over to what Vicky said at Davos. Let's talk about sort of real energy information and her sort of view of what's going to happen over the next few years.
Well, as you guys know, Oxy's been pretty out front in terms of things like net zero and direct air capture investments, et cetera. But I thought it was interesting that this was a sideline comment. Apparently, I didn't even know Vicky was going to Davos, but here we are.
I mean, shit. You become CEO of an oil company. I'm going to Davos, baby.
Probably the quietest Davos we've seen in a while, and we can talk about the political implications of that here in a minute. But she basically said, "Look, we're in a market imbalance right now, as I think we've seen crude and products trade in a fairly sloppy fashion. The equities are out of favor again, and so we've got an abundance scenario, as Doomberg calls it, playing out currently. We've gone from tight to abundant." What Vicky said was, "Look, because we have so underinvested in exploration over an extended period of time, look to 2025 and beyond to be a return of tight oil markets." And I think that speaks volumes about, you know, where demand's headed and what we've seen in recent data points, despite the pronouncements by the IEA that we're going to be seeing peak fossil fuel demand within the decade. You know, Vicky's pointing out kind of the here and now, which is, look, we haven't done an adequate job of exploration. And as I think about longer ago data and just looking at global annual exploration results, haven't seen an update, and it used to be part of the BP statistical review. What we're finding on a global basis is, one, insufficient to replace. I think she quoted, we're at 25% replacement relative to what we produce and consume every year, when that used to be like 5 to 1. I've always had a bit of a cynical view that I can create more reserves with a pencil than I can with a drill bit. But that notwithstanding, you know, pointing out that we've been leaning heavily on not really exploration dependent shale success. Now we need to get back to the business of restarting the exploration engine globally. And, we're going to be facing some shortages or at least a tighter market balance.
I mean,
in 2025 and beyond, in her view.
She had more to say, but let's just stop for a second. When I was researching, before I started investing into the space, and I researched opportunities, one of the glaring things to me was the underinvestment in exploration. And even when I joined Shell, many of my colleagues were like, you're crazy. You shouldn't invest into exploration technology and projects. I'm like, what are you talking about? This is a huge underinvestment. All the majors have been underutilized. They've been looking to buy acreage versus find acreage because it's a lot cheaper to find a barrel of oil when you find it yourself, but it's also a lot harder. And most of the oil and gas companies have been taking the easy way. And the shale revolution almost sort of suspended this potential issue that Vicky brings up. And I think she's absolutely right. We have not been investing in exploration. It's catching up. And I think maybe 2025, it'll be interesting to see when it does.
I mean, where's most of the capital and valuation that's been raised by the industry, both public and private? Where has it been directed? It's been directed at unconventional shale, and not making bets on exploration oriented as we used to think about them. Like Spinnaker comes to mind, which was long ago Gulf of Mexico deepwater oriented model.
Right.
But you had a special set of capabilities and data in a business model that was supported, at least to some degree, by the public markets that was, a vestige of long ago, which now I don't know anybody raising money around a pure kind of exploration play at this point.
Yeah, but what the saying I always like is nothing cures low oil prices like low oil prices. Nothing cures high oil prices like high oil prices. The interesting thing to overlay on y'all's discussion right there is, we had really high natural gas prices, which meant we could go get these tools. We had fracking. I mean,
Right.
Is fracking modern? No. You know what John Wilkes Booth did before he shot Abraham Lincoln? He was a fracker. He threw dynamite down the hole. I mean, we've been fracking wells forever. We drilled, I think, our first horizontal well. I think it was actually offshore in like 1936.
That's right.
So we had these tools sitting out in the shed. All of a sudden, we got $10, $12 natural gas. So we go get those tools. We use those tools. We figure out how to make shale works. So my question is, to kind of like overlay what y'all are just saying, is if we get that next spike, if we get, call it $125, $150 oil, we get $10, $12 natural gas, what it is there anything in the tool shed we can go get that we're going to make work? And that's something that I sit around and think of and I haven't seen. You know what I mean? You could put together in 2005 or 2007, if we figure out this horizontal drilling and this fracking that we're doing on natural gas, if we figure out for oil, we could double U.S. oil production. You could at least think about
That's
it.
Right.
That's
right.
I was not predicting it, or obviously I'd have been short as opposed to long oil that whole time. But I guess my point is, I'm worried. You're worried that we're not looking for the rock. I'm worried that we don't have the tools sitting around to find to mess with rock that we already know about. It's another edge of the sword.
I think Colin brings that point up, is we extract so little oil from the ground as it is today as a percentage. It's mostly water and other things. I think that's a good point. But I also believe there's a lot more places in this world to find oil. And we've underinvested in the tools and technology to find it. And I think that's going to come home to roost we're going to solve it one way or the other, but I predict, and it's funny, Vicky predicts that oil prices as a result are going to be up, $5 to $8 more this year over last year.
Yeah, we averaged 78 last year, and 80 to 85 is the call for 25
That's
and
her
beyond.
call,
in the tight market, which
bold.
isn't a lot, but it's it's better than what we have.
Are you
now.
predicting higher or lower than Vicky?
I'm predicting just continued volatility, and I think that's
spoken like a true trader.
That's the
That's
problem.
all they care about.
That's the problem with establishing any kind of continuity of getting on a path to more balance between unconventional and the opportunity presented by, okay, let's move recovery factors a few percentages and get more of the oil in place because it's captive, it's short cycle, we know the resources there, versus, hey, investor, I want you to commit. And oh, by the way, I'm expecting a premium valuation for a longer cycle business model defined as true conventional exploration, which, for major projects in a major play have multi-year type of appraisal timelines, not to mention, all the development risk, et cetera. Mm-hmm. You have a completely changed investor landscape from, what's the terminal value of oil and gas because of the whole transition dynamic in the middle of it. So I think it's harder to just establish that continuity and pivot into something that Vicky's saying we need to do a better job of and do more of what we think of as conventional exploration, because that's where the big needle movers over time come
Let's see
in.
what her budget is this year in exploration. Let's see if she puts her money where her mouth is.
That'll be funny. Last thing I'll say on this, because we've talked a while ago about Art Berman's piece about how, and when Ted Cross came on from Novi Labs, came on my podcast, and we talked about it, it was, seeing performance degradation from new wells. I've thought about this a little bit. I'm not thoroughly convinced that that's not self-induced, meaning got a lot of volatility in the price. I'm going to do everything I can to get 18 months worth of production out where I can hedge, lock it in.
Absolutely.
And so I may not have as good a well, but I have way more certainty on that well than if I potentially went with smaller frac, produced at lower volumes, and drug it out over time. So I'm sure we've drilled our best stuff first, and there is a degradation in rock quality that we're drilling now, but I'm also not sure it's not just self-induced. So Exxon?
Yeah, they went to court Sunday night, 5:00 in the Northern District, which is a little bit of a shift from where they usually file complaints in the Southern District. But
I wish I knew a lawyer to ask the question why they did that. I found that odd too.
Where is
in Fort Worth? At least in the Reuters piece that I saw, there was a Hart's piece talking about Exxon filing a complaint to get follow this and Arjuna Capital's resolutions for Exxon to adopt Scope 3 targets, medium-term Scope 3 targets, back in the proxy and up for a shareholder vote at the May 29th meeting. Exxon said, look, we want to use the courts to file a complaint to, I think, challenge the SEC's rulemaking in this regard and actually have the resolution removed so it can't even be voted on. And their point is, look, at least based on the statistics, they've had similar resolutions at least over the last two annual meeting periods, the proxy periods, that last year only garnered 10% support and the year before 28%. And basically, I think what Exxon's saying, look, we've already put this to the shareholder vote. It's not in the shareholder or the company's best interest to continue to kind of flog this distraction. And Exxon is the only one of the Western majors that has not adopted Scope 3. And we've talked about that
That's right.
Before as well. So we'll see how this, they're asking for a decision or relief by March 19th. I think their proxy has to be filed April the 11th. But to the point, why in the Northern District as opposed to the Southern District? In the Reuters article, there's an opinion that this particular judge is
Judge Reed O'Connor. He's always gone conservative.
Been very favorable to conservative side of the argument.
That's why. Here you go.
I mean, hey, I was smart on their case. I mean, so Arjuna, which by the way, they're known for their interest in yoga, which how do they get from yoga to sustainable investing? I don't know. That's a different discussion. But Arjuna's argument,
don't mess with their chi.
I mean, they've got good chi, clearly, but they're arguing that if they don't align with sort of the medium-term targets in the Paris agreements, including Scope 3, it's in the best interest of the shareholders because they might in the future lose access to capital markets and policy interventions, which
we can't bribe officials anymore. Basically,
exactly.
Is that what they said?
Exxon, on the other hand, has argued saying the sole aim of their campaign is to harm the company's existing business model, which makes a lot of sense.
Well, this is all about, the headline of the majors are not spending enough in terms of their portfolio allocation on alternatives to their core business or their core portfolio, which is oil and gas.
No.
And we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years, the industry has really found discipline and has been ultra responsive to the demand for better returns of and on capital. And so these are capital allocation decisions. I think back to what Mike Wirth said at their rollout day on New Energies 2021, I believe, in September. And he was challenged as to why they're not committing to a chunk of wind and solar investments. And he basically said, we don't have the competitive position to generate returns that would make
that can compete against oil and gas returns
or anything else in their stack of investments, including alternatives. And so this goes back, the Exxon goes way back to Lee Raymond days, but more recently, this is just a continuation of the whole Engine 1 saga, but they were very, very deliberate and explicit that we are not going to commit to a Scope 3.
I mean, well, what's interesting to me is this is the first time Exxon has ever tried to seek exclusion of a shareholder proposal through court action. So it'll be interesting to see if this is a trend.
Do we know if it's ever been done before anywhere else?
No idea.
I do not know that. We were getting into wonky levels of SEC policy making that's kind of beyond me. The one thing I'll say is I am severely disappointed in myself. I must still be jet lagged because I was not able to make a downward dog joke during that segment. We were talking about yoga.
You just did.
Well, I lost my fastball, man. There was something in there. We had lawyers, we had yoga, we had environmentalists, and I couldn't make the downward dog. Anyway, I still like, because wasn't it Exxon that said we're a molecule company, not an electron company?
Right.
Yeah. So, and I go back to a point you've been making for, almost 2 years on BDE. I think you made this point when you guest hosted a long time ago that the whole point is, why should the oil and gas companies do it? Why shouldn't Apple do it? Why shouldn't Microsoft do it? Et cetera.
Or why shouldn't I be accountable for, that order I place for the redundant or the extra trip that the Amazon truck makes to my house? That's,
Yeah. Exxon didn't.
I should have done a better job of planning to not emit as much at the Scope 3 level and save that fuel for a non kind of repetitive or duplicative type of situation. So it's really the practicality of accounting around it for oil and gas companies. And I think it's fraught with all kinds of confusion at a minimum on how we ultimately account for Scope 3, which are arguably the largest sources of emissions related to fossil fuel burning or in production and refining. But it's so dispersed out there in the consuming community that it seems to be, I don't know if once you sell that product, how do you adequately and accurately account for that?
Yeah, there's going to be double, triple, quadruple.
And I know there's a big modeling and factor assumption in the middle of all that. I think at some point you just kind of lose your place in trying to calculate the absolute kind of real numbers that you're looking for.
It's very, very true.
And what I think what Exxon and others are telling you is that it just adds a tremendous amount of unnecessary cost with questionable return on, good data and information that would point you toward tackling or solving the problem.
It says here that companies have sued in the past, often involving disputes over the applicability or interpretation of Rule 14A-8, which governs the inclusion of shareholder proposals in company proxy materials. Companies may argue that a proposal doesn't meet the criteria outlined in the rules, such as falling under the ordinary business exclusion, which allows the company to omit proposals relating to its ordinary business operations, which scope 3 may fall right into that. So interesting to see. We'll see what happens.
All right. We talked Vicky's stuff in Davos. Give me a point or two about Davos, because I thought it was great. Y'all know what I'm referring to. The Argentinian?
The milieu speech.
Oh my God, it was awesome.
Describe what happened there.
So he basically got up there and channeled his inner Milton Friedman and just told the whole world they're fucked because they're a bunch of socialist pigs. And he felt like he was almost calling them out by name.
Yeah.
And it was great. He said that free markets, capitalism's the only way to survive, and he let them have it. And the single greatest thing about that speech is he flew their commercial, right, to do it. No private jet. Number two, the fact he would even say it. I'll give Klaus some credit for even inviting him, though, because he knew he was going to get that. And then 3, the greatest thing about it was the AI voice translator that put it into English in his voice. That was awesome.
I mean, it was almost like you could lip read his speech in English with that voiceover. It was perfect. A little scary, but
the another good thing that happened that I think is slightly underreported, and I'm going to get the guy's name wrong. I think it's Kenneth Roberts, who's CEO of the Heritage Foundation. He was included in a panel talk, and he lectured the world elites on being undemocratic and destroying the planet. So you had a couple of good shots coming out of it.
I think they probably expected the organizers and Schwab probably expected some of this, just given what's happened on the global political scene here in the last few months with milieu and what happened in the Dutch election, et cetera. So, and then heading into what's going to be a very interesting 2024 election here in the U.S., there are real energy security and policy implications at the heart of all of this. And so they're starting to see signs of pushback at the ballot box that I think, are likely to continue. Although this is but one election cycle, and short memories have a way of taking over as soon as another distracting event takes place. But it just feels like fundamentally that people have been absorbing quite a bit of extra costs, and they're starting to link that politically to some of the top-down mandates, et cetera, that have been worked into policy by the unelected.
So the thing I'll say about Donald Trump, you can like Donald Trump, hate Donald Trump, but I don't think there's been another politician in my lifetime so attuned to what I will say the common man as Donald Trump. Say what you want about the guy. The guy understands the frustration of the factory worker who lost his job because the factory moved to Mexico, and Donald Trump will tell him, don't worry, I'm going to tax the hell out of the Ford if they move the auto plant down to Mexico and all. I mean, he really does understand, and I think has a way of communicating with the common man that's on par with anything I've seen. Even he has said, day one issue, immigration, we're going to shut the border. But number 2, it's been drill, baby, drill. So, I mean, the fact that Donald Trump is leading with that on a day one event says you're right, Mark. People are starting to get it.
Yeah, and I still somewhat bristle at the notion when I hear politicians from either side talk about, we need to get back to energy independence.
Right.
That's something we've been talking about for a long time.
We hit record levels of production last year in September and October 13.2 million barrels a day, and we're seeing a bit of a flattening. But, this notion that there's going to be some political watershed moment with a new administration that's ultimately going to change the pace and level and production trajectory that is largely driven by investors, both public and private, and those companies responding to or not responding to the incentives and disincentives to invest capital or return capital to shareholders. We're doing a pretty good job with our kind of restrained level of activity. Rig count's down, 20+% since September, et cetera. Where it goes from here, we'll see. But it's I don't know if naive is the right word. The energy industry, particularly in the U.S., works in a very different way than what the political voices are suggesting that it does. That short-term policy has had a major detrimental effect or a major incentivizing effect. I don't think that's the case. We're playing in a global market and all of the commodities, including natural gas now. And, we have an industry, as I said, that's largely driven by a lot of independent decisions that are driven by investors on the front end of all that.
And it's not necessarily, we talk about energy independence, but it's not necessarily, that's an inaccurate phrase to some degree. It's almost take the handcuffs off of the local producers and let them, number one, export, like, we're talking about LNG, but there's a lot of refineries, for example, built on the Gulf Coast that import oil because the oil that we take out of the ground here, they can't refine that. The refineries were built for importing. They're not going to turn those around or change them, but ultimately what we're saying here is let the energy companies, let their economics go unlimited. Let them be able to do whatever they can to maximize their business, which is ultimately saying make the United States business friendly again. That's one of the big challenges is all the requirements and the inability. We're talking about Toby Rice up in Appalachia. Where is he going to send the gas, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a lot of things that Trump is promising that has opened a lot of people's ears.
Well, there's all kinds of regulatory reform, and you did a podcast recently on one of the oldest kind of.
We're talking about the shipping.
What's the right term? The Jones Act.
The Jones Act, baby.
And
1920.
And detrimental decisions like things like closing down Everett,
right,
and not being able to connect the northeastern endowment of natural gas to New England
and not allowing me to buy alcohol on Sundays.
Yeah,
I mean that's a big issue.
That really is. The one thing I think I will say in defense of politicians, because energy is a pretty complex event, when they talk about energy independence, if they phrased it this way, they might be closer to right. And I do think at the end of the day, it matters is we could at least be independent if we wanted to be. If you think about it, if we got rid of regulations and stuff, we're drilling a lot, we have a lot of production, we could be if need be. It would take a lot of investment, replumbing, and just the threat of that. I think keeps changes the geopolitical balance.
But I think could we theoretically refit the refining complex to take much more domestic production? Yeah,
sure.
But that's reversing tens of billions that were spent in the 2000s to make sure that we had the most complex system in the world because the future was going to be heavy sour.
Right.
That's not what happened.
Right. That's right. And I think the other bigger question, and this really goes to Mark, is when is the Woodlands going to become energy independent? But also, when are y'all going to build a wall?
I already have. The Hardy total is a long fucking way up there.
Yeah.
It's not a wall, but
it's always when someone has to come that way, it's always an almost intolerably long trip.
You already have a wall. It's just called distance.
It's called time and distance.
One of the things that we have talked about, we talked about Trump, but we're talking about this is the year of voting, isn't it?
Yeah.
On a global scale. Chuck?
So the girlfriend, we need to give credit, challenged us like we did last year on BDE, where we went through Europe and we broke down each country and talked about their energy usage and decided not to treat Europe as a uniblock and instead dive into some detail. She read an article and pointed out in 2024, 7 out of the 10 most populous nations will go to the polls. Bangladesh, India, USA, Indonesia, Pakistan, Russia, Mexico, some geopolitically strategic countries, Taiwan and the UK. Also, some interesting energy companies are going to have votes. The Congo, which technically happened December of this last year, but we'll need to talk about it. Mozambique, the European Parliament, and Azerbaijan. So almost 2 billion people in 70 countries are going to vote this year. And layer on top of that, we've got AI now that pops up. What will that do to elections? Watching what China's doing, the Belt Road Initiative, etc., all the stuff we've been talking about here, precious metals and the like. So it's going to be a really interesting year. So her suggestion to us was each BDE close with 2 or 3 minutes on some of these countries, the elections, and maybe how those could impact energy.
And when we talk about a country, you have to bring a food from that country to BDE.
Let's do that. I like that.
Because we'll have a cultural experience as well.
I love that.
Let's do that.
So maybe next time we'll do the Congo, and I'll be in charge of food.
So there was one that I picked up that's in this mix of politics. I see she's got listed for April, India, which is out this past week talking about doubling coal production by 2030 to 1.5 billion tons and adding another 88 gigawatts of thermal power by 2032, which, the opposition will say that's not what we agreed to at COP28, et cetera. But what you're seeing is, in some ways, policies that are being driven by and being designed to create stability and a sense of political well-being in your home country. India being, I think, a really good example of that, just given that the vast majority of their power production is coal and looks to be for the foreseeable future.
It's their cheapest form of energy by far.
Yeah, and they're not the only ones either. I mean, Indonesia's got a tremendous amount of coal endowment, and we've talked about that. And
politicians don't get reelected if people freeze.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I think as Dan Pickering said coming out of COP28, you have a lot of dancing around, talking about and agreeing to things, and then you kind of go home and you do what you want.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's in my mind, India is a good example of really just doing what you want, because it's, I think, politically inadvisable to do things that create.
It's just basically a real fancy cocktail party.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had 2 meetings when I was over in London, just with folks that friends with on LinkedIn, a really sharp young petroleum engineer for one of the big companies, and an investor relations guy for a company that has assets in Africa. And both of them, through separate conversations, mentioned if the West is going to say to developing countries, let them eat cake, i.e., you guys don't get cheap energy like we do, that's not going to end well.
Completely agree.
Exactly. All right, BDE Wildcatters, thank you for joining us this week.
Wait a minute.
Oh.
We got to hear about the
Cowboys. We were going to freaking miss this.
But first, before that, I have, with a heavy heart, one of my idols, which I don't have idols, but I looked up to him as a child all through my life, has passed away. Jackie Burke Jr., who was 100 years old, passed away on January 19th.
Legend.
I saw him not so many days ago. I got to say goodbye in some ways. Great man. He won the Masters. He's won the PGA Championship. He won 16 tournaments, and he was a great leader of Champions Golf Club where I play golf. He's going to be well missed. There's been some great people coming out and talking about Jackie Burke stories, but he will be missed in the city of Houston and in the golf world. So
rest in peace.
Rest in peace, Jackie.
So Digital Wildcatters. Oh, just say it. Go ahead. You can break me.
Now we can talk about
you can
the
break
Dallas team. What are they called? Do Woodlands follow Dallas because you're closer than the Texans?
I think it's a coin toss for most people. It's not for me. But.
You do fly out of Love Field, right? All right. Here's the deal with the Dallas Cowboys. It does seem like Tony Romo and Dak Prescott appear to be the same guy. And I love Romo. I actually think Romo's greatness is undershadowed by the fact that the team never did that well. There was actually not a lot of talent on those Dallas teams, and the fact he would get them to the playoffs. But anyway, McCarthy's gone 12-5, 3 years in a row, which normally you'd build a statue to somebody that did that. But the disappointing ends to each one of those playoff games where he just appears outmatched. The teams aren't ready to play. I don't know how you bring him back to coach. The one rumor I've heard is that Belichick just said word, no way. I'm not dealing with the mess. But you had Drabel, who's
you don't want to live in Dallas or deal with
Jerry
Jones.
Deal with Jerry Jones. Mike Vrabel, who's in effect Bill Belichick light, and by all intents and purposes a really great coach.
What about Harbaugh? He's going to the NFL. Everyone knows it.
He is.
Where's he going?
He seems like he's spending a lot of time talking to San Diego.
Yeah.
Or excuse me, the Chargers, which are now in LA, much to Mike Umbro's chagrin.
Yeah, which is arguably the best quarterback situation out there if you're a coach.
My new old favorite NFL coach, though, and I haven't spent a lot of time watching the NFL over the last several years, but the exchange prior to the game in Detroit between a reporter who they have not shown or named yet, asking Todd Bowles, the head coach of Tampa Bay, how he was planning to prepare his team for the frigid temps in Detroit.
This is great. He
looks at the reporter and says, "You do know we play indoors."
For 50 years. It's not like they built
they've been playing indoors in the Silverdome and Ford Field for the last 50 years. And he said, it'll be about 20 seconds from the time we get off the bus and get into the stadium, so I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal.
But these blue-collar teams, I love their outdoor stadiums. You got Green Bay, you got like Buffalo. Their fans are they're more rabid and incredible because
the
they
Buffalo
have to sit in the
fans
elements.
showing up the shovels and
it's amazing. So I think Detroit is just weak for that reason.
So I was in Cleveland. And this was years ago. It might have been pushing 15 years ago. It was a Thursday night game. They were playing the Steelers. It was supposedly the coldest night of the rivalry, and Municipal Stadium sits right there on the lake. And it feels like every ounce of wind comes down, picks up as much cold water and moisture, and just flies right over the stadium. So it was freezing cold. Mike Hines, my business partner, was smart enough to drink wild turkey that night, so he was fine. I drank beer. I froze from the inside out. But two observations from that night. One, generally speaking, the working class ticket season holders of the Browns can buy one jersey in their life. So when you buy that jersey, you then put tape across the back and change the player's name. You change their numbers with tape because you can't afford to go buy the next nice jersey. And so just seeing all of the old Cleveland Browns players, like a Jim Brown jersey that's been changed through the years to different stuff, was priceless. Number 2, happiest guy I've ever seen in my life was literally out there in shorts, no shirt on, drinking away. And he passed out halfway through the game, and everybody just left him in the stadium. It's crazy. But anyway. All right, BDE, we will rush out to the prayer vigil to pray for Colin and his injured prostate, and hopefully it'll get well and he'll join us again. Thanks for watching.